The entire fight ended in just 7 seconds. They say the bigger fighter walked in smiling, certain the room would side with him. He had weight, reach, and the kind of confidence that comes from being rarely challenged. Bruce Lee didn't argue, he didn't pose, he didn't explain. 7 seconds later, the fight was already finished, so cleanly that some witnesses didn't realize they had just seen the decisive moment. There was no celebration, no bruised ego on display, only a quiet shift in the room, as if everyone understood something they hadn't understood before. The gym was not the kind that produced stories, it was the kind that erased them. A narrow space tucked above a row of small shops, reached by climbing a stairwell that smelled faintly of dust and old sweat. Inside, the air was thick with routine. Leather, resin, damp cotton, metal. The floorboards held the marks of years, scuffs from footwork, drills, faint dents where heavy bags had been dragged, darker patches where sweat had dried and been cleaned and dried again. There were no posters of champions, no framed certificates, only work. Men trained the way men train when no one is filming. They hit pads until their shoulders lost heat. They sparred without drama. They wiped blood from lips as though it were a small inconvenience. Nobody shouted advice unless it was necessary. In that kind of room, reputation was not currency. Proof was. Bruce Lee arrived with none of the signals people expected. No announcement, no introduction that framed him as something special. He stepped in with the calm of someone entering a familiar environment, not a stage. He wore plain training clothes, clean but modest, nothing that suggested rank. A few people recognized him immediately, others did not. He stood back and watched, not with the expression of a critic, and not with the smile of a celebrity enjoying attention. His face was neutral, his eyes attentive. The posture was relaxed, but the attention was sharp, distributed across the room rather than narrowed on one thing. In gyms like this, silence is not emptiness, it is evaluation. When one of the trainers finally approached, it was with the controlled politeness of someone managing a busy room. They spoke briefly, too quietly for the others to hear clearly. Nothing ceremonial. Bruce Lee didn't ask for anything special. He didn't request time. He didn't insist on space. He waited. That patience mattered. It signaled he understood the rules of this place. And the rules were simple. Nobody interrupts the work. One of the fighters, strong, broad in the chest, older than the rest, noticed Bruce Lee. He didn't stare immediately. He pretended not to care. But when someone believes in their own presence, they feel when another presence doesn't move around it. The fighter's name wasn't important in the beginning, but inside that room, he mattered. He was one of the biggest bodies there, and he had the sort of confidence that makes other men accommodate him without thinking. He trained hard. He hit hard. He wasn't cruel, but he carried himself like someone who was rarely corrected. When he moved near the ring, people made space. When he spoke, others listened. Not because he demanded it, because his force made it easier to listen than to resist. He noticed Bruce Lee again, closer this time. Bruce Lee didn't shift away. He also didn't step forward. He remained in neutral space, as though the fighter's weight, height, and certainty had no special meaning. This is what some witnesses would later describe as the most unsettling part. Not that Bruce Lee was fearless, but that he seemed uninterested in fear as a concept. Around them, training continued. But the room was beginning to change. It was subtle, the way tension enters a gym. It doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives in pauses, in longer silences between rounds, in the way men stop joking and start drinking water without speaking. The fighter finished his round on the bag and stepped back. Sweat darkened his shirt. He looked around, first at the trainer, then at Bruce Lee. It wasn't a glare. It was an assessment. A few fighters sensed it and stopped their own movements slightly early, as if their bodies had recognized the moment before their minds did. Bruce Lee didn't meet the stare aggressively. He met it calmly, with a neutral expression. Not provoking, not conceding, just present. The real challenge didn't begin when words were exchanged. It began when the room collectively decided, without voting, without agreement, that something was about to happen. Not because Bruce Lee had arrived, but because the gym had noticed him. And now the gym wanted to know whether he was real. The bigger fighter walked toward the ring slowly, towel around his neck, sweat cooling on his skin. The movement wasn't theatrical, it was practical. But people noticed, anyway. He looked at Bruce Lee again, longer now, without pretending it was accidental. It wasn't anger. It was the curiosity of someone who has heard a rumor too many times. The kind of curiosity that isn't satisfied by stories, because stories can be edited. The kind that wants to feel the answer through pressure. Then he spoke. The words were not loud. They weren't even particularly disrespectful. He didn't call Bruce Lee names. It was, in the strictest sense, polite, but the meaning carried a hard edge. He said something about style, about what works, about what doesn't. It was the old argument between what looks impressive and what survives pressure. Bruce Lee listened without changing expression. No defensiveness appeared. No attempt to win the room with a clever reply. He didn't attempt to persuade anyone. He simply let the man speak until he finished. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, measured, and brief. Not a speech, not a philosophical statement. More like a clarification, a quiet agreement that the only real answer was demonstration. That was all. The bigger fighter blinked once, as though he hadn't expected such a simple acceptance. He was used to resistance. He was used to men refusing or men boasting or men turning the moment into a performance. Bruce Lee did none of those things. He simply stepped toward the open space near the ring and stopped. The room adjusted. Without being told, people moved aside. The pad work stopped mid-round, as if someone had cut the sound from the room. It didn't feel like excitement. It felt like a clinical pause, as though the gym itself wanted a clear view of a question being answered. A trainer leaned in and whispered to another trainer, voice barely audible. Something like, "He's overrated." The words were meant to remain private, but the room did not react to the whisper, and once those words existed in the air, the gym began to tighten around them, because now something was at stake: credibility. The bigger fighter stepped into the cleared space with controlled confidence. His face wasn't hard. It was almost calm. He looked like a man prepared to prove something simple. That strength and size mattered. That timing could be overwhelmed. That myths dissolved when pressure arrived. Bruce Lee stood opposite him, calm, shoulders loose, hands hanging naturally at his sides. No guard, no bouncing, no theatrical breathing, just stillness. A few witnesses would later say that this moment, the moment right before anything happened, was the clearest memory they had. Not because it was dramatic, but because it felt like standing near a door just before it closes. And then, without announcing it, the invitation became something else. The room did not call it a match. No bell rang. No referee stepped in. But every man present understood the same thing. This was no longer observation. This was confirmation. It is difficult to describe the moment a room becomes a ring. No one declares it. No one asks permission. It happens through small movements. Someone stepping back a half pace, another turning sideways to create space, the rope skipping in the corner, slowing until it stops altogether. The bigger fighter took his place as though the space belonged to him. Not arrogantly. Familiarity does that. His hands rose halfway, relaxed but ready. His feet settled with natural competence. It wasn't a dramatic stance. It was practical. Weight distributed, shoulders aligned, gaze fixed on Bruce Lee with calm intent. Bruce Lee stood opposite him, differently. Not incorrectly, just differently enough to be difficult to categorize. His hands remained low, his shoulders loose. He did not bounce on his toes. A few men in the room, trained to read posture as intention, found themselves irritated by it, because it didn't translate cleanly. The trainers leaned closer, ready to evaluate, to gather evidence, to confirm the private belief that the stories were inflated. No one began counting seconds. No one announced rules. There was no referee's warning. This was not sport. It was a test, conducted under the quiet agreement that anything decisive would be understood without explanation. The bigger fighter made the first move, but not with violence. He stepped in with a controlled advance, shoulders angled, not committing to a strike yet, just taking space. This was a common tactic. Make the smaller man react. Force him to show his habits. Bruce Lee did not step back. That was the first surprise. Bruce Lee adjusted his position with a movement so small it barely registered. A half step, a slight turn, a shift of weight that changed the angle of approach. It wasn't retreat. It wasn't even avoidance. It was placement. The bigger fighter paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed the advance. He expected Bruce Lee to raise his hands now, to adopt a defensive posture. But Bruce Lee remained almost open. The bigger fighter tried to provoke a response, a shoulder feint, a small hand motion, the beginnings of a test strike, not full force, but enough to create a flinch. Bruce Lee didn't flinch. What happened next was the kind of thing that becomes difficult to describe later, not because it was too fast, but because it was too clean. Bruce Lee made the smallest entry. Closing distance at the moment distance should have remained dangerous. The move wasn't a leap. It wasn't a charge. It was simply that Bruce Lee was suddenly in a place where the bigger fighter's advantage didn't function. And he arrived there without announcement. A hand touched, a wrist perhaps, or the forearm. Witnesses disagreed later on the detail. What mattered was what happened to the bigger fighter's intention. It stopped, not in a dramatic halt, more like a thought interrupted mid-sentence. The bigger fighter's shoulders tightened briefly, as if trying to reassert control. He attempted to reset his range by shifting his weight backward, but the effort didn't produce the expected effect. Bruce Lee stayed aligned with him, not clinging, not wrestling, simply positioned in the one place that made the bigger man's strength less relevant. It was the first time the room felt the difference between power and control. The bigger fighter tried again, this time with more commitment, a stronger step forward, an attempt to bring force into the exchange. Bruce Lee responded with almost no visible strain, a small turn of the hips, a redirection of angle, a brief, precise interruption, no wasted movement, no flourish. What looked from a distance like nothing was, up close, an exact dismantling of timing. The bigger fighter began to breathe louder, not because he was tired, because he was confused. Confusion in a physical exchange is costly. It delays decisions. It makes hesitation visible. Bruce Lee seemed to understand this without commenting on it. He did not punish the man for mistakes. He simply allowed those mistakes to exist long enough for the room to notice them. Around them, the gym was no longer just watching. It was recalibrating. Later, witnesses would say 7 seconds. Some said it was closer to 10. Most admitted they hadn't counted. They only knew it ended before their minds had fully accepted that a fight had begun. Bruce Lee entered once more, not with anger, not with spectacle. A simple decision made at the exact time the bigger fighter committed his weight. There was a decisive interruption, small, precise, something that turned the bigger man's posture into uncertainty. His knees softened slightly, His shoulders dropped in a way that wasn't chosen. His face shifted, not into pain, but into the brief blankness of a system interrupted. He did not fall, but he could not proceed. The bigger fighter stood upright, but upright now meant something different. His stance was no longer a threat, it was a question. Bruce Lee stepped back. That was important. He didn't chase. He didn't punish. He didn't press advantage for spectacle. He removed contact the moment the outcome was established. And then it was over. Not announced, not celebrated. The gym did not explode into noise. There were no cheers. Instead, there was the kind of silence that only happens when men witness something that cannot be explained with their usual language. Bruce Lee stood calm, breathing controlled, eyes neutral, as if nothing special had happened. But in the posture of the bigger fighter, in the subtle slump of shoulders, the changed distance in his eyes, the room understood the truth without needing anyone to say it. The fight had ended, not with violence, with removal. For several seconds after it ended, no one moved. The bigger fighter remained upright, feet still planted as if the room had not yet given him permission to shift. His hands hovered in front of him, not in a guard anymore, more like a man checking whether the world was still arranged the way he remembered it. It wasn't pain that held him still. It was something more private, a recalculation. Bruce Lee stood a few feet away, already back in neutral space. Arms relaxed, shoulders loose. No expression of triumph, no invitation for applause. That restraint kept the room from turning into theater. One of the trainers finally shifted his weight and lowered his clipboard completely. The gesture was small, but in the language of that room, it was an admission. What he had expected to measure could not be measured with the tools he brought. The bigger fighter took one small step back. It was not retreat in the typical sense. It was the instinctive space-making that occurs when someone realizes proximity no longer belongs to him. He looked at Bruce Lee with a different expression now. Not hostile, not embarrassed, almost puzzled. He gave a small nod. Not a bow, not surrender, just acknowledgement. Then he spoke, briefly. Not an apology, not praise. A simple sentence, almost practical. Something like, "All right." The trainer who had whispered overrated did not repeat himself now. He stood quieter than anyone, face controlled, as if admitting he had been wrong without letting it become a joke. The gym began to come back to life in fragments. A rope swung again. A bag was tested with one light strike. Pad work resumed, but the rhythm was different. Slower, more deliberate, as if they were listening for details they used to ignore. The bigger fighter didn't storm off. He stayed in the room, leaning briefly against the ropes, watching Bruce Lee with a look that was no longer confrontational. It was investigative, almost respectful. Bruce Lee remained unchanged through it all, not cold, not distant, simply composed. That posture, the refusal to dramatize what had happened, did more damage to the challenge than any strike could have done. Because what finally collapsed wasn't the bigger fighter's body. It was the room's need to argue. The gym never wrote it down. No one issued a statement. There were no photographs taken deliberately. No interviews recorded afterward. That is how these things survive. Not through publicity, but through precision. The men who witnessed it did not speak about it immediately. 7 seconds is not a comfortable number to repeat in a serious gym. It sounds like exaggeration. So they kept it quiet. But silence has its own way of spreading. A few days later, one of the younger fighters mentioned it in another room. He didn't make it grand. He said it the way you mention something that doesn't fit your own understanding yet. He stopped him. Just stopped him. The listener asked how. The young fighter paused. He tried to describe it, and failed. And that failure to explain became part of the story. Because if it was merely a trick, it would have been easy to describe. The older trainers spoke even less. One of them, the same man who had whispered that Bruce Lee was overrated, was remembered for changing afterward. He watched more carefully now. He spoke less when he didn't know something. He stopped laughing at techniques he didn't understand. It wasn't humility the way people like to romanticize it. It was adjustment, the kind men make when they're forced into honesty. The bigger fighter stayed in the gym for weeks after. He didn't act wounded. There was no bitterness. If anything, there was a slight quietness in him that hadn't been there before. When he sparred, he began to pause in moments where he used to rush. He looked for timing rather than collision. And in that change, the room understood something important. That 7 seconds didn't just end a fight. It changed a man's training. People outside the gym later tried to turn it into a story of domination. That was the version that traveled fastest. But the men who had been there corrected it when they could. No, they would say. It wasn't like that. Bruce Lee didn't hurt him. Bruce Lee didn't humiliate him. Bruce Lee didn't even look angry. That was the part that stayed consistent every time the story was told. The memory always returned to the same image. Bruce Lee stepping in calmly, without announcement, and stepping back as though it wasn't personal. Years later, the story reached other gyms, other cities, other circles. It crossed oceans through conversation. Those who heard it listened, skeptical. Then they heard the part about the silence, how no one cheered, how no one laughed, how the trainers stopped taking notes, and skepticism shifted into something quieter. Not belief exactly, but attention. Because a room full of fighters doesn't go silent for marketing. They go silent for reality. Bruce Lee himself rarely spoke of incidents like that. When asked about proving himself, he didn't list wins. He didn't describe men he had beaten. He pointed to efficiency, to simplicity, to the idea that nothing extra survives pressure. And those who had witnessed the 7 seconds understood what he meant without needing him to say it. Over time, the story became one of those quiet legends that resisted decoration. Not because people didn't try to decorate it, but because the truth was already complete. It didn't need extra violence, extra drama, or extra words. 7 seconds was enough, not as a measurement of speed, as a measurement of clarity. Years later, some of the witnesses could still remember the exact sound of the room afterward. Not shouting, not excitement, just the return of ordinary training, bags swinging again, ropes turning, pads absorbing strikes. But the room was different, because it had briefly been shown something that could not be argued with. And Bruce Lee, still calm, still contained, still uninterested in applause, had left behind the kind of legacy that doesn't need trophies to survive. A legacy built on restraint, on quiet certainty, on a demonstration so minimal it refused to become spectacle, yet so decisive that the people who saw it never fully forgot it. Not because it was loud, because it ended noise.